All right, so we're going to get into 1 Kings chapter 5 tonight, and we're actually going to go 5 through a little bit of chapter 9. So we're covering a lot of ground, but you're going to notice that a lot of the chapters really have to do with a lot of kind of details that we don't have to really read every single part of. So 5 through a little bit of chapter 9. When we last left Solomon, we had a couple of better stories about him. At least on the surface they were. So God offers Solomon a gift of whatever he wants, right? And so Solomon kind of displays his own wisdom by asking for wisdom, right? He really selflessly and really on behalf of the kingdom in general, he asked for wisdom because he's going to have to be the ruler. And then we have the story where Solomon displays his wisdom with this kind of impossible problem involving these two prostitutes who come to him for a solution. We read on about how Solomon sets up his kingdom. We learn upon doing a little bit of digging that Solomon has a habit of favoring his own people. He even has some of his own family, his relatives, in administrative positions in the kingdom. He also sets up a system that kind of weakens the tribal system. So the boundaries of Israel, you would think, would be the 12 tribes boundaries. Solomon doesn't do it like that. And so he kind of weakens the tribal loyalties and systems by doing something different than just the tribal boundaries that they would have had. And then we also ended on this paragraph that talked about the breadth of Solomon's understanding, or literally in Hebrew, it talks about the wideness of his heart and his mind, which sometimes in the Bible is a negative. That Hebrew phrase is a negative about the wideness of someone's heart or mind. And so, could Solomon have been a little too open-minded with the wisdom that he is gaining? And so with his wide open mind, did he just accept everything? And is it that openness to everything and anything that led to, hey, Jim, wherever you need to go, you're good. So is it that sort of openness to just anything and everything that kind of leads to Solomon's downfall in the end? So we're going to notice this a couple times tonight. You have in these stories about Solomon, they look really good on the surface, but we know looming behind all of this, or I guess out in front of all of this, is the fact that the kingdom begins to destabilize and split. And so all the stuff that looks good about Solomon, you wonder, okay, well, it's got to go bad somewhere, and we'll get a little bit into that tonight. So we're going to get into Solomon's big building projects. We're going to talk about the temple and Solomon's palace as well. We're going to cover a lot of ground, but I think we can do it because so much of it is like measurements and details and things like that. So we're going to hit the broad strokes in a few places. Here's what we're going to notice. So much like last week, we'll read this stuff that at a glance makes Solomon look good. So if you just kind of glance at it, read through it, and move on, it looks like Solomon is doing well and he is accurately displaying wisdom. But if you kind of dig in a little bit, you see there's a little bit more going on, and there's things that we might be able to critique Solomon on as we move forward. And it may be no surprise about the kingdom, what happens to the kingdom in the end when we dig in. So let's jump in, 1 Kings chapter 5, and go ahead and go to verse 1. And it says this: When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon because he had always been on friendly terms with David. So this relationship with Hiram, the king of Tyre, is not a new one. It does go back to Solomon's dad, David. So last week we talked about how David had conquered Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, and he had really taken over it from other people. So before the Israelites inhabit Jerusalem, it was a longest city for someone else. And so they're called the Jebusites. And so last week we hit this part of the story. So if you go back to 2 Samuel, so we're in Kings now. It talks a lot about Solomon and the rest of the kings. If you move backward to Samuel, you get those stories about David that we keep referring to. So 2 Samuel chapter 5, this is verse 6 and 9. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. And then you skip to verse 9. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the city of David. So David, when he first enters into Jerusalem and calls it home and makes it his capital, and then pretty much immediately Hiram gets involved. So only two verses later, now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. And so tonight we're going to see Hiram get involved again with Solomon, pretty much for the same purpose. It's really all about building materials. So what you may know from other reading or even other places in the Bible, the cedars of Lebanon, so around where Hiram is, the cedars of Lebanon are legendary. And so if you wanted to build a house and build a palace, it'd be really nice if you could import this legendary material and kind of showcase that in your building projects. So we'll see Hiram get involved again. So verse 2, back in 1 Kings, verse 2, Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. So remember, David is a man of war. So David asks God if he can build God a temple, and God tells him what? God tells him no. And why does he tell him no? He's a warrior, right? He's got blood on his hands. And so he says, your son is going to be a man of peace, so he's going to build my temple. You can't build it. You've got blood on your hands. You are a warrior. And so we see that played out right here. Also, in this verse, in verse 3, you have it's this phrase, a temple for the name of the Lord. And what do you notice about the word name in your Bible? It's capitalized. So this is a phrase that you'll see again and again and again. This is how they refer to the temple. It's not the temple of the Lord. It's the temple of the name of the Lord. And so what this is really doing is they're referring to the temple in a way that acknowledges that God himself cannot be contained inside the temple. And so the name, the idea of God's name, is kind of a stand-in for God when they talk about this temple. So not the temple of the Lord, as in this is the place where he is housed, since he cannot be contained. This is the temple of his name. This is the temple that honors his name. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but other gods and other cultures, the god of those cultures, they would reside, they would be located in their beliefs. They're located in that temple. But this is not the case for the God of Israel. The God of Israel is free to go wherever he pleases, cannot be contained in the temple. So this is not the temple of the Lord. This is the temple of the name of the Lord. So it's definitely a way to honor God without saying that he fits in there and has to stay in there. Verse 4. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on all sides, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, your son, whom I will put on the throne in your place, will build the temple for my name. Verse 6, so give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians. So you might read this verse and think, okay, Solomon's being really generous here. I'll pay you whatever wages that you set. But you have to ask this question. If you're a business person at all, is it wise to just agree to whatever wages that the other person is setting, right? And so verse 7 says, when Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased. Of course he was. Solomon just said, I'll pay you whatever you want me to pay these guys, right? And he said, this is Hiram, praise be to the Lord today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, I have received the message you sent me and will do all that you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place where you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away, and you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household. So it's maybe just me, but I have a feeling you know what this is like. Have you ever been in a negotiation that you felt like was almost going too well? Like you go and you wonder, all right, well, maybe I'm offering a little too much for this car, right? The person selling me this car seems really, really eager to sell me this car and get this deal done. So maybe I'm offering too much. This is going almost too well, right? So you offer a number for a car, for instance, and they say, yeah, should I deliver it to you? Do you want me to detail it? Should I provide you a chauffeur for the first 30 days? Like, they're ready to sell you this car at whatever price that you gave them because it is a really good deal for them, right? So this was me several years ago, and I was on the other end, but I was trying to sell a car. And I had this little Honda Accord that we were going to get rid of. We were moving down to Florida from Tennessee, and I had this little Accord. And we're about ready to move, and we decide we're going to just get rid of the car altogether so we don't have to move it. And so I put it on Facebook Marketplace. It was not new. I didn't need to turn it into a deal or anything like that. It goes on Marketplace. This thing is sold within 2 hours. And then I have this uncomfortable thought of, I didn't ask enough for this car, right? Like this shouldn't have happened this way. And so I think this is kind of those negotiating deals where you're like, I probably was not wise in this deal. They seem really eager to go ahead and close this up and shake my hand on this thing, right? And so you should wonder, is this what's going on with Solomon? So he says he's going to pay Hiram whatever he wants for these men and these wages, things like that. And then on top of that, he's going to provide food for Hiram's household. And so you wonder if Solomon should have been a little bit wiser and maybe stingier with the kingdom's resources than to just agree with whatever Hiram was going to do. Because Hiram seems real happy right now. So in verse 10, it says this: "In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs he wanted." And this is where it gets pretty crazy. Verse 11, "Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores," and you probably have a footnote that says that is 3,600 tons. Imagine that number. 3,600 tons of wheat. And listen, wheat's not heavy. So how much wheat does it take to get to 3,600 tons of wheat? And then in addition to 20,000 baths, so you have another footnote probably in your Bible, that's 120,000 gallons of pressed olive oil. And here's the kicker. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. And so if you read ahead and you look at chapter 9, it looks like that arrangement probably continued for about 20 years. That Solomon is sending 3,600 tons of wheat, 120,000 gallons of olive oil. And here's the problem. We learned in the last chapter, Solomon is already taxing the kingdom. He's already trying to secure resources from the rest of the kingdom for the capital, right? He's already doing this. And then also in chapter 4, we learn that foreign nations are bringing Solomon tribute. So what is Solomon doing with all this stuff that he then needs to go outside to the king of Tyre and offer 3,600 tons of wheat and 120,000 gallons of olive oil every single year for 20 years? And what's he going to get back from it? He's going to get a handful of cedar logs, which I'm sure are nice, and I'm sure he's going to get quite a bit for a palace and for a temple and things like that, but it's not like it's an unending supply. And for 20 years, Solomon's on the hook with all of this food that he's going to send back to Hiram. So again, you wonder if Solomon could have been a bit stingier with what he was offering back for these things, right? Could he have gone back for another round of negotiations? Verse 12. "The Lord gave Solomon wisdom just as he had promised him. There were peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty." So read verse 12 and you wonder, so maybe for the author, the wisdom is not really about the negotiating deals right here. Maybe for the author, the wisdom is about the peace that existed, right? And so maybe it's not a great business deal, but at least there's peace between Solomon and Hiram. And of course there would be, Hiram loves Solomon right now. He's providing loads of food for him. Verse 13. "King Solomon," here's another kicker, "conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men." So he offers to pay Hiram's people, and still he needs labor from Israel as well. And so he has 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month so that they would spend 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of this is key, of the forced labor. Now, interestingly, it's the forced labor that's probably the spark that ignites the fire of rebellion later on. So if you were to skip ahead to chapter 12, what you have in chapter 12 is that there's a man named Jeroboam. He's kind of the mouthpiece of the laborers, and they're not happy. And so what has happened is Solomon has died. His son Rehoboam, this is a little bit confusing because their names are similar. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, is now king. Jeroboam, on behalf of the laborers, says, "Please, will you relax the harsh treatment of your father? He's worked us to death." And so Rehoboam goes back and forth with his advisors, ends up saying, absolutely not. If you thought he was hard, I'm worse, right? And so this is really what happens. A huge portion of Israel rebels with Jeroboam, kind of that mouthpiece, as their leader. And so now in chapter 12, that's where the kingdom ends up dividing. But it all comes back to this here in chapter 5. King Solomon conscripts laborers from all Israel, and that does not go well in the long run. Does that make sense? So this is the beginning of the end, you might say. So it all looks good. Temple's being built, great building projects. Jerusalem's going to look real, real nice. But these are the seeds for the end of the United Kingdom that's here. Verse 15. Solomon had 20,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Byblos would have been other skilled laborers out of this general area where Hiram was, they cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. So this is the end of chapter 5. And in chapter 5, we see Solomon's dogged determination to make sure that this temple actually happens. So it's been talked about since the time of his father, and he is going to be, by golly, he's going to do it. And so you see him making maybe not so great deals to make his pet project actually come to fruition. So he's conscripting his own people as forced labor, which is going to come back to bite him, or really come back to bite his son, rather. And so in the end, you end up with this beautiful temple, I'm sure, but it comes at a really, really stiff cost if you're paying attention. So honestly, it reminds me, and you guys may have had this experience as well, who's been to Europe and seen like beautiful cathedrals in Europe, right? You've been there before, it's amazing. And so they're beautiful, there's a sense of reverence that's there, but if you think about it too hard, then you begin to wonder, okay, how did these building projects actually come to fruition? Because a lot of those would have been in the time when the church was experiencing loads of corruption, or when the church was selling indulgences, right? Who knows what indulgences are? Anybody? Nancy, what are they?
If you have sinned, it's a way to have your sin forgiven.
Right.
You pay for it, you get an indulgence.
Right. And then even further, it was kind of a way you could pay for the sins of loved ones, you could pay for the sins of dead loved ones, right? And so it's almost like you could buy a ticket to heaven. I don't think it works that way. But the Catholic Church was treating it as if it did. And so they're making loads and loads of money because who doesn't want to guarantee a spot for themselves or for their loved ones in heaven, right? And so this is how a lot of these amazing, beautiful cathedrals come to be, right? And so you have this idea, there are ways to honor God, but then there are also honorable ways to do it. And so you begin to wonder about, okay, how does Solomon really build this temple? Which one of those fits his building method? All right, so that wraps up the first chapter tonight. So let's go to 1 Kings 6. And it starts off this way. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of King Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, so that's a month that would be in kind of an obsolete ancient calendar, the second month he began to build the temple of the Lord. So one thing to notice about this, which is really kind of a big picture thing about the Old Testament, is almost 500 years after they left Egypt, it is still a really, really big deal to them. So they're basing how their events happen, and they're basing kind of how they date things based on when they left Egypt, right? And so it's something for you to know as you look into the general Old Testament, right? 500 years later, this is still looming large for them. So as you read the Old Testament, just know you're going to see a lot of references to the Exodus from Egypt, in some cases long, long after it happened, because that is a foundational piece of their identity back then, and it even still is today. And so just one thing to notice as you study the Old Testament. So we're going to skip through a lot of chapter 6. Most of it is about temple details. This is kind of some of the dry reading that you sometimes get when you read the Bible. Probably the most important thing to know is that the temple was 90 feet long, it was 30 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. So those are some dimensions. So your Bible will have it in cubits probably, but then there's usually those footnotes that help you understand, okay, what is it in feet? I don't know what a cubit is. What is it in feet? I think it was Josh earlier today at the morning session of Bible study. He said, what you were reading, it was about the size of a basketball court, but narrower.
It's the same length of a basketball court, but
but half the width, right? And so we were looking downstairs this morning. We were actually down in the social hall. And so it was almost, maybe if you can imagine the width of the social hall, but the length of a basketball court, right? So that's just something to know about the temple. The temple was made up of 3 rooms, if you will. So you have a porch or a portico. This is really the threshold of the temple. You have what's called the main hall in a few places, or you might see the term the holy place. And then you also have the inner sanctuary, or has been called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. You see that in a few places as well. So I could walk you through it, but I think a video might be more helpful. And so let's take a look at a 3D video of the temple. So what you have the floor plan and the furnishings in the temple are really all carryovers from the traveling tabernacle that was a part of Moses' day, and really on up until they had the temple itself. And so the structure and the stuff inside it is really based off of the traveling tabernacle. But Solomon really just kind of scales everything up once he takes control of the project. And really what happens is everything from Moses' tabernacle goes from mobile and a tent that you can pick up and move and things like that, and then it all just really gets more permanent, because the temple is of course going to be a stationary place. Jerusalem is their home, it's their capital, and so there's no reason this stuff needs to move anymore. So it all gets nicer and more permanent. And everything is also kind of gilded, and it reflects a lot of royal power when you get into the temple. So here's what's interesting. In the middle of all the details and the descriptions that you have in chapter 6, it's almost like we get interrupted as we're reading it. And so what I want you to do, open up to chapter 6, make sure you're there. Just skim with your eyes verses 1 through 10 of chapter 6. You don't have to say anything. Just kind of look and see what you notice. Just kind of skim through. What do you notice about 1 through 10? And then move to 14 to 38 and do the same thing. Skim through. What do you notice about verses 14 to 38? 1 through 10 and 14 to 38. What you're going to notice in both those sections is it's just full of the details, right? And again, this is a lot of the dry reading that you get sometimes in the Old Testament. So it's all about how ornate this was and the size of this and how much gold was used for this, things like that. But in those couple of verses in between, we have this interruption from God. And I think it's really, really important. So it's kind of a reality check for Solomon, and it's really a reality check for us. So again, 1 through 10, 14 to 38, full of details, full of all the stuff and how it's put together, things like that. But in the middle, God says this. The word of the Lord came to Solomon, this is verse 11, and I love how the word of the Lord starts. It says, "As for this temple you are building." Right? I love it's how God kind of gets Solomon's attention. As for this temple that you are building. So if you notice, at no point in chapter 6, as we're going through all the details, at no point does God have any input on this. So not about the size or the grandeur or the overall flashiness of it. This really, really clear. This is Solomon's design in chapter 6. So you have the blueprint of the tent or the tabernacle back in Exodus, which does come from God, but then Solomon has his fingerprints all over this new temple. And so God's not really involved much at all in chapter 6, except for this little middle part. And I love this. God's words to Solomon is almost like he's talking about Solomon's personal hobby that he just happens to be tolerating at the time, right? It seems like it's not really on God's number one on his radar. And so he's like, as for this temple that you happen to be building, right? Because if you look back to when David first wants to build the temple, we find out that apparently God was doing just fine the whole time in a tent, right? So again, let's go back to 2 Samuel real fast. Let's see if I can get this advanced. So again, these stories about David in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 7, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling." And I love this part. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? So God's not complaining, right? God's been living in this tent, moving around. God is not asking for the temple, right? So he's been doing just fine. And so you have to wonder, is the temple a way to honor God? Or is the temple more of a flex from Solomon, which we know Solomon already likes to do, right? He likes to show people his power. Or maybe it's a bit of both. Benefit of the doubt, maybe it's a bit of both. But let's go back to God's word to Solomon, and it really gets to the heart of the matter. So one more time, 1 Kings 6, verse 11. The word of the Lord came to Solomon, as for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father, and I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. In other words, just building a nice house for me does not command my presence to be there, right? It doesn't guarantee my presence is going to be there. And so if you look at what God actually does have to say to Solomon, he doesn't really talk about the temple, other than just kind of his introduction, as for the temple you are building. But the meat of what God says here has nothing to do with the temple, right? It's not really about that for God. And so again, you can build a really, really nice place, but it doesn't guarantee God's presence. God is more concerned about other things than just this really nice building. So again, you think of cathedrals in Europe, right? Beautiful places, but is God making his presence known in those places? Most of them feel more like museums than actual churches anymore, if you've been to those, right? And so here again, we see God giving this conditional agreement. So God says, this extravagant temple does not command my presence, but I will grace you with my presence if you're faithful to me, right? And so this is something we'll come back to as well. So this is high on Solomon's priority list, not so much for God's. So we'll come back to that. All right, before we get into chapter 7, let's read the closing words of chapter 6 real fast. So go to the very end of chapter 6, and it closes out this way. In the 11th year of the month of Bul, the 8th month, the temple was finished in all its details according to its specifications. Solomon had spent 7 years building it. And then you go right into chapter 7. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. So one thing to know about the Bible is that the chapter divisions are not original to the Bible. So chapters were added much later, around the year 1200 AD, so over 1,000 years later from when Jesus was around, more so from this story. And so it's added much, much later. And so there really should not be any division between chapter 6 and chapter 7. So those two verses should be read back to back, and it should sound something like Solomon took 7 years to build the temple, but 13 years to build his own house. Right? That's how those should be read. And so this should be striking to us as it probably was striking to the original readers as well. And so thus far, we've had these different critiques that we've been building against Solomon. And so we're using inferences that we can make about the text and what's going on in the culture of the time. But admittedly, some of those critiques, they may or may not have been intended by the author. This one, however, does seem like it is the author's commentary, right? The author is saying Solomon takes about twice as long to build his own house than for God's house, and it doesn't seem like that sits well with the writer of Kings. So the first part of chapter 7 is about Solomon's palace complex. And so if you skim through the palace reading, and I've got a picture here, you're going to notice in verse 2, you see the palace or the house of the forest of Lebanon in verse 2. And so it's called the forest of Lebanon because it is made up of many, many different cedar pillars that are there. So that's one thing that Solomon got from Hiram, of course. And later on in chapter 10, there's a reference to Solomon storing like a number of shields in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So we think that may have been kind of a royal storehouse or treasury, something like that. In verse 6, you'll notice the colonnade, which here is labeled as the porch of pillars. And it's really kind of an entryway. It's a threshold into Solomon's throne room. Verse 7 talks about the throne room or the throne hall. Here it's called the porch of the throne. So that is where Solomon rules from, and that is where he exercises his power to judge. And it says to judge, and again, we had this last week. We see these references to being a judge, even though that's not how we think of a king should be, right? So this is a carryover from long before when their rulers were judges, and you see some of that influence still sticking around for kings. So we think kings are much more elevated, operating at like a 30,000-foot view, but Solomon apparently is solving disputes between prostitutes, right? So it's a very, very different level of involvement from what we would think of. Verse 8, you see separate palaces for Solomon himself, as well as Pharaoh's daughter. And so you see those on the left-hand side of the screen there. And so I don't think we're off base to wonder what the locals may have thought of as Solomon builds this house for his foreign pagan wife, right? We talked about how, Israel is set apart. They're supposed to be different. And then he welcomes in a foreign wife. And not only that, builds a house for her next to him and in pretty close proximity to God's house, right? And so I don't think we're off base to wonder, what do the locals really think about this? There's a foreign queen, and she resides here in close proximity to God himself. So you can see here the temple is surely impressive over there on the right side of the screen, but you also look at what is called Solomon's palace, and it's a complex, right? And so there's a disparity in sizes between what was built for God and what took almost twice as long to build for Solomon himself. And so I think the author is wanting us to ask the question, okay, where are Solomon's priorities really? 7 years to build God's house, almost twice as long to build his own, and it's much larger and it's a complex. And the rest of chapter 7 is really about the furnishings of the temple. So it's kind of strange. We get temple stuff in chapter 6. Then in the first few verses of chapter 7, it moves to the palace. And then we go back to temple stuff in the latter part of chapter 7. And again, we're not going to go through every verse of chapter 7 there. But there's a few things I want to highlight that are significant as you read through. So we've already seen a lot of foreign influence in the kingdom itself. And so you have Solomon marrying a foreign princess. You have Solomon building quite the palace for her. You also have Solomon striking a not so favorable deal with a foreign king, and then overworking his own people to get involved there. And then as we get to the temple furnishings in chapter 7, we're going to notice another foreigner's involvement there. So go to verse 13, chapter 7, verse 13. And it says this: King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Hiram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was from Tyre and a skilled craftsman in bronze. Hiram was filled with wisdom and understanding and with knowledge to do all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. So here we have this guy Hiram, and his name in Hebrew is actually identical with the king's name Hiram. So he already kind of shares a name with this foreign king from Tyre. And you're going to notice it does say Hiram's mother was from the tribe of Naphtali, so this is an Israelite tribe. But it also says his father is a foreigner. His father's from Tyre. And so at best, we can say that Hiram is like mixed race, if you will. But we have to pay attention to the language in verses 13 and 14. So in verse 13, it says, Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Hiram. So what that reads like in Hebrew is like Solomon receives Hiram, right? And so where does he receive him from? He receives him from an outside nation, a foreign place. He's coming from an outside place into Jerusalem. It mentions Hiram's father as a foreigner. It also attributes all the skill that he has learned, everything that he is bringing in with him for the temple. It attributes that skill to the foreign father as well. And so it seems like in these two verses, the writer really, really wants you to know, despite having an Israelite mother, Hiram's father and his skills and his influences really come from Tyre, right? So this is another way to say there's more foreign influence. You have Pharaoh's daughter, you have the king of Tyre, you also have this guy who's going to work on all of our sacred stuff, all of our furnishings for the temple, and he's a foreigner as well, right? And so with all the emphasis in Israel's history about being set apart, being different, not intermarrying, not sharing culture with people, well, now all this stuff from Solomon's wife to the king of Tyre to the guy who's working on our sacred stuff, all of that should raise some important questions for the reader about the amount of foreign influence that is being had on the temple, on the furnishings, on Jerusalem itself. Does that make sense so far? So, and again, that's a little bit of digging into a couple of verses, but I think it's there. And again, I think the author wants you to know there's some foreign influence happening here, and the people reading may not have been really good with that. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So let's go on to chapter 8. Again, a lot of chapter 7 is about just details and things like that. We can skim through that. So look at chapter 8. I'm going to read kind of a long section at the beginning of chapter 8. It says this: Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of Israelite families, to bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethanim, the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and the Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place. And they are still there today. There was nothing in the ark except for the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord had made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he will dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." So, this is really kind of the dedication of the temple, or the grand opening, you might say. And of course, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant in with them, and that's where it's going to reside. That's going to be the permanent home of the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant is kind of a symbol of God's presence in their midst, and it's going to be a feature of that inner sanctuary, the holy place, Holy of Holies. You've heard it called several different things. And here's what's interesting. So the cherubim that you saw from the video, they're kind of these like sphinx-like creatures. And people at the earlier session, they noticed it kind of seems like there's a bit of blending of influences here, because what do the cherubim really look like? They look Egyptian, don't they? Right? And so there may be some blending of cultures and influences here because they are, neighboring. And so cherubim are sphinx-like creatures. Many scholars believe that these cherubim with outstretched wings kind of formed a throne for God, you might say, which would then make the ark the footstool of God as he sits on his throne. And so we have evidence of this from other cultures. And so this is not something just out of the blue. We see this in other places. And so this is an ivory plaque that talks about a prince from an area called Megiddo. And we're going to focus in on this section here. And so I have a tracing of it so you can see it better. So in this ivory plaque, we have this image of this prince figure. And what's he doing? He's sitting on a throne of cherubim, and he has this box as his footstool in this ancient picture. So I've got another one. So this would have been the sarcophagus of a king from Phoenicia. So this is another ancient sort of thing. And his name is Ahiram, which is related in name to Hiram. Not the same guy, but related in name. So not Hiram, but Ahiram. And so on the sarcophagus, we're going to focus on this piece here. And I'll blow it up for you. So it's this figure here, and I also have a tracing of it so we can see it better. So same idea, king sitting on a throne of cherubim here, and he has this footstool box sort of thing here. And so this is a common thing that you see from these ancient cultures, this sort of throne setting for the king or for somebody who's really, really important. So let me add just one more layer here. So this box that would have been their footstool, oftentimes it would contain things like treaty documents in it, right? And so I guess that was their safe deposit box. And so treaties that they had made with other lands, things like that. So the Ark of the Covenant is really supposed to contain, the 2 tablets that Moses receives from God back in Exodus, which effectively reads like a treaty document. There's been lots of books written about this where the language that you see in Exodus reads a lot like a treaty between 2 nations, but it's really God and his people saying, this is what it's like for us to live together, right? And so here's how you're going to act, here's what I'm going to do for you. It's this conditional agreement, and it reads like a treaty. So inside the Holy of Holies, so if you go back in the temple in your mind, inside the Holy of Holies, you have this throne room of God, and it's set up as if the cherubim are his throne and the Ark of the Covenant is his footstool. And that image does look a lot like other cultures of the time. So we've been over this so many times. Israel they're called to be set apart. They do look a whole lot like other people. So Solomon, at his most creative, creates a throne room for God that looks like this. Looks like everybody else's throne room, right? And so just one more critique of Solomon and really of Israel. But you also have these symbols that are kind of walking a balance, because you have the image of God's throne and his footstool. But remember, we talked about how the temple is the temple of the name of the Lord, right? So God does not reside here. So these images are walking this balance of, yes, this is the place of God's presence. Yes, this is where we're going to aim our prayers towards. But we also acknowledge that God cannot be contained in this temple, right? And so we have this bit of tension between the symbology of it, but also the reality that we acknowledge that God is actually not residing there on a permanent basis. He's free to move in and out as he pleases, of course. Verse 14. While the whole assembly of Israel was standing there, the king turned around and blessed them. And then he said, "Praise be the Lord God of Israel, who with his own hand has fulfilled what he promised with his own mouth to my father David. For he said, since the day I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city in any tribe of Israel to have a temple built so that my name might be there. But I have chosen David to rule my people Israel. My father David had it in his heart to build a temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord told my father David, you did well to have it in your heart to build a temple for my name. Nevertheless, you are not the one to build the temple, but your son, your own flesh and blood, he is the one who will build the temple for my name. The Lord has kept the promise he has made. I have succeeded David my father, and now I sit on the throne of Israel, just as the Lord promised. And I have built the temple for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. I have provided a place there for the ark, in which is the covenant the Lord has made with our ancestors when he brought them out of Egypt." So Solomon begins to address the people by really restating a lot of the stuff that we've already known and we've already seen in our reading. So God brings his people out of Egypt. He does just fine traveling with them, being in a tent. He has got no complaints, right? And so David wants to build a permanent home. God says, no, it's going to be your son. And the main purpose of the temple is that the covenant is going to reside there. And then Solomon has a prayer. And as opposed to what we've already seen from Solomon and the critiques that we have made, Solomon's prayer is actually pretty good. So I have to give him credit. So verse 22, then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel. So in this picture, before the altar of the Lord, where is Solomon? Is he inside or is he outside the temple? He's outside, right? You don't burn your sacrifices inside the building, right? It's common, fire marshal would have something to say about that. So he's outside. The people are outside. He's with the people. He's praying, which again hits on this idea that God's not actually in the temple, right? He has the temple right behind him, but he's going to be outside with the people because he's praying because he knows that God cannot be contained in the temple. And then just a few verses later, you have Solomon acknowledging this in verse 27. So as a part of his prayer, Solomon says, "But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I have built?" So don't forget, Israel and God, they're supposed to be set apart any other culture and religion, you would have the idea that the temple is the house of their gods. They reside there, but not so with the God of Israel. Even the highest heaven cannot contain him. All right, so we're going to breeze through a lot of chapter 8. The prayer, you can go through that. It really is a good prayer. But I want to point out a couple of things that happen in this prayer. So Solomon prays about different calamities that might strike the people of Israel, and how all these things will be solved if they pray towards the temple. And so, for example, verse 44, so look at chapter 8, verse 44. Here's kind of an example of this. He prays this: when your people go to war against their enemies, wherever you send them, and when they pray to the Lord toward the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for your name, then hear from heaven their prayer and their plea and uphold their case. So this is kind of the temple. This is kind of the formula that Solomon uses over and over and over in this prayer, right? So when all these things happen and we look towards your temple, we pray towards your temple, will you hear and will you uphold our cause, right? So this is happening again and again. So the solution to several problems that they may face in the prayer, a famine, drought, war, things like that, is that they would remember the temple, remember God's presence, and that God would act on their behalf. And one more time, lest we think that God resides in the temple, look at verse 45. Where does God actually hear their prayer from in verse 45? Was that? From heaven, right? So God's not in the temple. They're going to pray towards the temple. God hears from heaven, right? So again, just hitting that point over and over and over again. So as opposed to the actual place where God is confined, the temple is actually kind of a physical location or a direction where you can aim your devotion. And if you look closely, you're going to notice Solomon names 7 different calamities in his prayer that may or may not happen to the people of Israel. Does it 7 times? What does the number 7 mean for the people of Israel? Completion, right? And so if you prayed something 7 times, it's basically saying, hey, if all this stuff happens, or if anything and everything happens to us, right? It's kind of a way to say, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Anything that can happen to us, will you come and will you act if we kind of aim our devotion towards the temple? And so at the end of chapters 5 through 8, you have a massive expansion of the city. So I showed you this maybe last week. We talked about the city of David, right? The city of David is concentrated at the bottom of the hill. And so that's what's called the city of David. It's the old town, right? The old city. And so what you have with Solomon is this big movement up the hill. And at the very top, you see this whole complex. You see his palace. And if you're looking real close, it's probably small, but you'll see the temple at the very, very top of that picture. So the development goes uphill, and pretty much half of that development is all about Solomon's palace and God's temple. And so that's what you have. That's really what is covered from chapters 5 through 8. What I want to do, I know we've covered a lot. Let's get a little bit into chapter 9, just barely, and that'll kind of wrap up the whole temple narrative here. So 1 Kings chapter 9, when Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time. So he appeared to him the first time, right? And it was at Gibeon. What happened there at Gibeon? Does anybody remember? Solomon has a dream. God's there. And God offers him whatever he wants, right? And so here we have another vision about God. And it says, just as he had appeared to him at Gibeon, the Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and the plea you have made before me. So that was chapter 8. I've heard the prayer and the plea you've made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. So God actually honors what Solomon has done, right? Maybe it wasn't done perfectly, but God's going to honor that. And so God says, my eyes and my heart will always be there. But listen again. So what follows is, again, another conditional agreement, a covenant between God and Solomon. So Solomon builds the temple, builds the palace, expands Jerusalem, and God's still like, yeah, but here's what I actually need from you. So verse 4, as for you, If you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. And as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. If you know the rest of the story, this is pretty much what happens to Israel. And as you read through that, it just kind of strikes me, even tonight as I'm reading it, if you read through the covenant and the agreement that God has with Solomon right here, how much do you think God cares about the temple? Not a whole lot, right? God has said, okay, sure, I'm going to pay attention, right? And I'm going to make sure my eyes and my heart are there. But then he goes on in this whole long speech about how what really matters is that you honor my decrees and my commands, and you honor him. And so God reminds Solomon, like he told him earlier, the actual temple and its splendor means far less to God than their obedience means to God. And so Solomon, it seems, he spent so much of his effort and his resources, his relationships, he even kind of spent his people and his convictions on the worldly stuff that God seems to care very little about. In fact, later in the time of Jesus, Solomon's temple had been destroyed at that time. It's massively rebuilt by a guy named Herod, and it's something, apparently, as you look in the Gospels, it's very, very awe-inspiring. The disciples stop to take it all in, and Jesus has no trouble acknowledging that one day this amazing complex is also going to come down again, right? He's got no trouble acknowledging these things that man has built, they won't be there, right? It's not going to last forever. And that's exactly what happens. That comes down as well. So you read this story and you begin to wonder, with all of Solomon's efforts, but also with God's kind of passive attitude towards it, is the temple more about God or is it more about Solomon? Right? It seems like it's a whole lot more about Solomon, which for me is exactly how these chapters become relevant to us today. So look at how Solomon compromises with a foreign king or with a foreign princess to get what he wants, or look at how Solomon uses people to get what he wants. And Solomon can turn around and he can pray all the right words and make it sound beautiful. And who can argue with a temple, right? It's all about God, right? But what is it really for in these chapters? And so how often do we try to do this? So how often do we try to dress up our own selfishness and parade it around like it's devotion? So let me give you a couple of examples. Do we write big checks and make big, impressive donations? But what we really want is for people to look at us and see what a big thing that we did and how generous we are, right? Do we do this? You don't have to raise your hand. Or do we go on a missions trip just so we can post that one picture on social media of us holding that foreign baby in our hands? You see that all the time, right? We want to make sure somebody knows what a really, really good thing that we did. And so we have that picture. You're obviously like in a third world country and you served and you were awesome, you know? Jesus talks in the New Testament about how people pray these long, fancy sounding prayers, and really it's about sounding really holy and not really about the words that they're praying. Or, here's a tough one, tonight, do we study the Bible so that we can get more to the heart of God? Or do we look at it and study it so that we can sound really smart and win some arguments? I don't know, right? Hopefully, this is about getting to know the true heart of God and really what these stories tell us about his people and what he wants from his people. But I think some people love to debate stuff, right? They love to get in arguments. And so what are we really doing? So here's a key question for us. I think a key question for us and for Solomon would have been this. Would I still be doing this if no one noticed? Would I still be doing this if no one noticed? Would Solomon build the temple with all of its gold and all of its size and all of its impressiveness if nobody ever saw it? If it was truly just a gift to God? Would I still go on this mission trip if nobody ever knew about it? Would I make this donation if nobody ever knew I was doing it? Right? I think those are the questions that we have to face, and those are the uncomfortable questions, and I encourage you, take that with you this week. This is going to be one of those kind of not iron sharpening iron, this is going to be one of those just things that really sharpens us in our faith. We ask the hard questions of ourselves. Would I still do this if no one noticed? And I think that's going to be a revealing thing for us and for ourselves. And I encourage you to kind of let that sit with you this week. And I'm going to do that for myself as well, right? I'm not up here saying I've got it all figured out. But there's places where I wonder if my selfishness gets in the way. And I really just want people to know this about me, when what I really should be doing is offering something to God as an offering. All right, that's all I got tonight. Any questions?